Hi, Professor Repetti here, lecturing on Hume on Miracles. I have a PowerPoint on this for those of you who are in my class, and I will generally be lecturing so that what I talk about is in sequence with my PowerPoint slides. So my first slide says, why are miracles important? So I'm trying to contextualize this regardless of why Hume wrote about it. My way of introducing this subject is to ask people, why do you think miracles are considered important? Every religion has miracle stories. How do they function for religious believers in that religion? What are they supposed to indirectly show? What makes a miracle possible? What is a miracle? In the religious sense, in the strictly religious sense, the sense of the term miracle has derivative meanings, right? Some of the non-literal derivative meanings of the term are miracles of modern science. It was a miracle I made it to class on time today. The miracle of birth, miracle cure, but the original religious sense of the term, things like Moses parting the sea, Jesus walking on water, turning water into wine, right? And what makes those things miracles in the literal religious or biblical sense is that they're otherwise physically impossible. Ordinary folks can't walk on water or part the sea by verbal command and their will, stuff like that, right? So these are things that are normally physically impossible. Another way of saying it is that they violate laws of nature, like laws of gravity. The human body weighs more than water, so if it just steps out onto water without anything else going on, all other things being equal, without wearing stilts hidden under the water or having hidden glass right under the water, that some magicians seem to be walking on water, but it's a trick, or without some kind of anti-gravity device that alters your molecules so that you weigh less than the water, without things like that, all other things being equal, is what we say in philosophy, letting everything else be the same, the human body on water will go down unless you lie on your back and breathe deeply and then you're floating. That's different from standing up upright on top of water. Right? So what makes miracles in this sense is that they are physically impossible. Right? Or another way of saying it is that they have to violate laws of nature, scientific laws, laws of physics, hydraulic laws, or whatever. Okay, so what is a scientific law? What's a law of nature? To really even just understand what it means for something to be a miracle, first, in the literal sense, it has to be physically impossible. It has to violate a law of nature. But what is a law? What is a scientific law? Right? Things like the law of gravity or other uniform phenomena identified by science that are always a certain way. So water always freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. Same idea in different language, mathematical languages means the same. It's the same temperature. Right? The law of gravity is universal. Of course, your weight on Earth is different from your weight on Mars or on the moon because the different sizes of those planets mean they have greater or lesser mass, which means the attraction towards the center of them is greater or lesser. But the law remains the same, and there are equations about it. There's all sorts of laws of physics, laws of thermodynamics. E equals mc squared, Energy equals mass, m, times c, the speed of light, squared. So the amount of energy in a system is always equal to that. Force equals mass times acceleration, F equals m slash a, right? That's a law. So these are all laws. And what makes something a law is that the phenomena that the law describes or is about always happen the same way, right? That's what it means to say it's a law. It necessarily is that way, or it must be that way, or it's always that way. It's never violated. There are never any exceptions. It's not like every now and then you can walk on water, or every now and then water just doesn't freeze at 30, 32, 31, 30 degrees, whatever, right? No, law means it always does, okay? So they have no exceptions, right? And think about it. How many experiments must be performed before scientists conclude that something is a law? Well, it's got to be more than just about any other series of experiments. So here's an example of some experiments that Galileo performed. He had colleagues standing on top of two different little mountains or hills, a certain measured distance from each other, with a lantern with a shutter blocking out the light, and open the shutter at a certain time and shoot a gun at the same time to test the speed of light and sound. And I believe the intuition was what most kids know nowadays is you see lightning and then it takes a little longer to hear the thunder. And so the intuition was that they're associated because when they're right near you, you see and hear both of them at the same time. But when they're far away, they come apart, which suggests that light is quicker than sound. So he measured that. He had, like I said, shoot a gun and open the shutter, revealing the light at the same time and having people at distant distances time when they saw and heard the light and the sound. And he fairly accurately measured the speed of light and sound. But now we have better instrumentation and we have more accurate readings on these things, but light is always at a particular speed, 186,000 and some odd miles per second, right? Sound is always at a certain speed. These are law-like, meaning there are never any violations or deviations from the way that they function, right? So an incredible number of scientific experiments have to be performed by people all over the world in different scientific communities before something is considered a law. Right? It has to be multiply confirmed and repeated over and over again without exception, then it's considered a law. Okay. And what kind of credentials do scientists have? Well, nowadays, most of them who devise experiments and write them up and analyze them, as opposed to just people working in a lab, which could be students or even graduate students or undergraduate students, but the people actually churning out knowledge from designing the experiments and interpreting the results, right, usually have PhDs in some branch of science, right? So they're experts. Okay, and how many of the experts have to agree for something to be considered a law? Pretty much all of them. Every now and then there might be somebody who disagrees, but by and large, the entire scientific community agrees about laws, and they are the experts. Okay. Now, I'll mention just one little possible thing about law-likeness and whether or not everything is law-like. Most scientists think that everything is governed by law, but that we just don't know all the laws and we don't know all the details. If we knew all the laws and where every particle in the universe was at a particular time, how everything behaves being law-like, if we had all that information in a computer, let's say all the laws and all the facts about all the atoms in the universe and where they were moving and what they were up to, we could then predict what the next step of the universe would be, what the next stage would be, what the next stage would be. That theory that the entire universe is governed by cause and effect laws is called determinism. One state of the universe determines the next state, or one state of an object determines the next state of it, or all of them in conjunction with each other. Okay, so like when meteorologists try to predict the weather, you go, oh yeah, well they're wrong, so maybe the world's not deterministic. Well, no, scientists just think, well, no, there's a lot of variables and we don't know them all and we don't know all the laws, and so it's just too complicated for us to predict accurately. But if a computer had all the information, we'd get perfect weather reports all the time, among everything else. Right? So the one exception is that at the subatomic level, at the quantum level, some quantum physicists say, this is disputed among physicists, that quantum phenomena are not deterministic. But that's too complicated to go into, and it's confusing even for physicists who think they understand it. So we'll leave that aside for now. The point of the matter is simply that it seems like the whole universe is deterministic, at least on the level of things that we're made out of, which is atoms. Right? Everything from the level of atoms and up. Cells are made out of a lot of atoms, right? And we're made up of a lot of cells. And so atoms and cells that obey laws of physics and chemistry and biology and so on. So everything seems to be deterministic. Now that might give us a problem about free will, but we're not here to talk about free will today. We're here to talk about miracles. Okay, so let's turn to two of Hume's claims. By the way, I have a reading about this also for my students, Repetti on Hume, where I only quote two or three of his paragraphs, but I summarized two of his main claims. One is that there's an a priori argument to the effect that miracles are impossible. And a priori is a Latin term that philosophers and lawyers and other intellectuals use, which means knowable prior to, a priori, prior to looking at the world with your senses. Right? So meaning based on reasoning alone. You don't have to perform any experiments or observations about how things happen to be to know certain things a priori, like 2 plus 2 is 4. It doesn't matter what your perceptions tell you, 2 plus 2 is 4. Right? Or if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is bigger than C. No matter what sizes those objects are. If it's true that A is bigger than B and it's true that B is bigger than C, then it follows logically that A is bigger than C. You can know that a priori without looking at anything in the world, right? So mathematical knowledge, logical knowledge, definitional knowledge, right? If Jones is a bachelor, then Jones does not have a wife, right? That follows logically from the meaning of bachelor, which means unmarried male, right? So some things can be known a priori. So what Hume is trying to say is that there's an a priori argument to the effect that miracles are impossible. Okay? The opposite phrase for knowledge that you can only get by observing the world through your senses, by having had experience, is called a posteriori, which means posterior to, behind or after having observed something. Your posterior is your behind, right? So now Hume is an empiricist, meaning the kind of philosopher who tries to base almost all knowledge on observation and sensory experience and experimentation and scientific method, right? But he's saying there's even just an a priori argument, right? Just a purely logical argument to the effect that miracles are impossible. Okay, and then the second claim is that there's an a priori argument. This is based on the first one, the first claim. There's an a priori argument to the effect that no testimony could ever make it reasonable to believe that a miracle occurred. A testimony is saying, I saw it, or even me thinking I experienced it. Testimony to myself. I remember having seen Jesus walk on water or whatever, right? Okay, so of course, if there's a logical argument to the effect that miracles are impossible, then that means that the concept of a miracle is logically impossible or contradictory. That means it can never happen. So if it can never happen, then you should never believe anybody who claims that they saw a miracle. That's the idea of his second argument. Okay, so give me a moment here. I'm trying to get my slide to move over. Okay, so 3 passages in Hume I quote to support him. Number one, a miracle is a violation of I'm quoting him, a miracle, quote, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire as any argument from experience can be imagined. So, in other words, because a miracle is by definition a violation of laws of nature, and laws of nature are things that are already proven by constant experience, like gravity always works, right? So experience has established, unalterable and firm, like the best scientific evidence has established, that laws are unalterable and never violated, right? Therefore, the proof against the miracle, from the very nature of the fact of what a miracle is supposed to be and what a law is, because by definition, miracle entails, violates law, right? But laws are by definition never violated, right? So that proof, from the very nature of the fact of what the meaning of miracle and law is as entire and as strong as any argument based on experience could even be imagined, right? So in other words, the very concept of a miracle violates a law, but laws by definition are inviolable. They can't be violated. They're never violated. So the concept of a miracle is contradictory. Okay? Yeah. Okay. So I'll say more about it later, and I'm going to use an analogy with deja vu. But let's weigh the claim of a miracle. All right? The claim of a miracle is of something that allegedly violates a law. So we'll make the claim, and then we'll say, what would the skeptic like Hume say in response to that? Well, laws are exceptionalist. They're by definition inviolable. So that makes no sense whatsoever. It's a contradiction. Something that's not possible is possible or occurred. Second claim. There's the things to notice about, this is the second part, should you believe a claim, right? One or a few people's testimony support the claim that they witnessed a miracle or read about it or whatever. On the other hand, all of science's testimony suggests that that's impossible. So you have to weigh in, on the one hand, a couple of people, one or two or few people, or even 1,000 people who claim that something happened thousands of years ago that got passed down by word of mouth or whatever it is. On the other hand, the entire scientific community of experts, right? Miracles, when they allege to occur, are usually one incident or a few incidents without any experimental controls. Conversely, science has endless repeatable experiments under scientific control, measured, controlled experiments. The witnesses to miracles are typically biased believers who are not professional experts on critical thinking, observation, scientific method, or anything like that, whereas science is composed of countless unbiased expert witnesses. There's like no contest. Miracles are not repeatable. Ooh, Jesus, do it again. I don't mean to be irreverent, but, and each religion has it built into it around that idea, like the do it again thing, that you're not supposed to test God or question God or doubt conveniently. Science, on the other hand, someone makes a scientific claim, it has to be repeatable in a laboratory. Anybody could perform the experiment and get the same result. If they don't, it's phony. And that happens. And those claims are rejected. Those who claim miracles, pardon me, those interfering phone calls, I don't know if you heard that. Scam likely. Those who claim to have witnessed a miracle or who believe in them are usually not skeptical at all. And they're not at least directly exposed to any kind of competition among people making such claims, right? There's usually not 20 people and 3 of them said, we saw it, and the other 17 people who were there saying, we didn't see it. Right? There's usually not that kind of environment, right? There's no skepticism presented hand in hand with, I thought I saw this, but, and then you explain what the possible weaknesses are. There's no skepticism or critical thinking when it comes to miracle claims, whereas science is loaded with skepticism and competition. Scientists are in competition with each other to disprove each other's claims or to prove them. You can get a paper published just by showing that you performed the same experiment that that guy did, but you didn't get the same results that he did. So either there's something wrong with the way he did it or the way that you did it or whatever. It's built into the nature of science, the initiative and intention to falsify claims, right? Okay. So that's the idea about why some of the reasoning, why I'm going a little further than Hume does. Number 1, the concept is contradictory. Number 2, for that reason, you should never believe anybody, right? But I'm breaking it down, like why the concept is contradictory, because what it means for something to be a law rests on the entire scientific community, hundreds of years of expert witnesses performing countless experiments and so on. All right, I don't want to be too repetitive. All right, second claim, quote rather from Hume, quote, there must be a uniform experience against every miraculous event. Otherwise, the event would not merit that name, miracle. And as a uniform experience amounts to a proof, there is here a direct and full proof from the nature of the fact against the existence of any miracle. Nor can such a proof be destroyed or the miracle rendered credible, but by an opposite proof, which is superior. End of quote. So let's go through that. There must be a uniform experience against every miraculous event, meaning a lawful experience that we always see gravity working. That's a uniform experience. That has to be the background against which an alleged miraculous event occurred, right? Something that defied gravity. Otherwise, the event wouldn't even merit the name miracle, right? Okay, so there has to be a law for somebody to even claim miracle. The law was violated. That's built into the nature of a miracle claim, right? And as uniform experience amounts to a proof, right? Like the fact that everybody always sees gravity being observed is a proof that gravity is real, right? There is here a direct and full proof from the nature of the fact against the existence of any miracle, right? Countless and like everyday constant experience confirms the law of gravity. That's the point, right? And that has to be the case for something to even count as a miracle. But the fact that constant everyday experience confirms and validates and proves the law of gravity, that automatically discounts the possibility of a miracle, right? There is here a direct and full proof from the nature of the fact, what a law and what a violation of a law is, against the existence of any miracle. Nor can such a proof be destroyed, like the fact that gravity is a law, it's inviolable, or the miracle rendered credible, like that Jesus walked on water or Moses held the water apart with his will or his word, right? That violates hydraulics and laws of gravity. But that can't be credible except by an opposite proof, which is superior, right? So the evidence for the alleged miracle has to be stronger and greater than the evidence for the entire scientific law, right? It's got to be overwhelmingly clear that in exactly the way that it's supposed to be, without any ifs, ands, or buts, is undeniable that a miracle occurred, right? It has to be that the evidence for the miracle has to be greater than the evidence for the law, because the evidence for the law is overwhelmingly universal and constant. That's his second quote. So let me summarize. I like to put this is like a two-part argument, right? 2 parts. Part 1, it's required for something to be a miracle that it violate a law of nature by definition. Otherwise, it's not a miracle. So, but if it allegedly satisfies number 1, then automatically number 2, it should be rejected. Why? Because it's a violation of the law of nature. Nothing violates laws of nature, right? So this is the idea of his first a priori argument. For it to count as a miracle, it has to violate a law of nature. That's required. But if somebody says that was satisfied, then we should automatically reject the claim because nothing violates laws of nature, right? So it's a self-refuting idea, the idea of a miracle. It's a contradictory concept. That's Hume's idea, okay? All right, moving right along. Third quote, my third and final quote of Hume. Give me a moment here. Yes, that's an Ohm sign. That might be backwards by the time you see this. I don't know. Om is a sacred mantra in Hinduism and Buddhism. We'll talk about that another time. Om. Quote 3, quote, the plain consequence is, and it is in general, a maxim worthy of our attention. A maxim, by the way, is a principle. Right? The plain consequence is, and it is a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony is of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact that it endeavors to establish. End of quote. In other words, the evidence in favor of the miracle has to be so overwhelmingly solid that it would have to be a miracle if that was false. We have to completely reverse all of our reasoning and our knowledge. I might not have said that the best way, but maybe another way of saying it is what I said earlier. It has to be stronger than all the evidence for believing that gravity is a law. A law is something that's never violated. So the evidence for the fact that that allegedly claim happened has to be greater than all of our evidence for the law of gravity. And I doubt that that will ever happen because usually when it comes to miracle claims, give me a moment here. Yeah, usually when it comes to miracle claims, like we said earlier, they're relatively weak. They happen by one or two people, that sort of thing, right? Just give me a moment. I want to see something in my slides here. Yeah. All right. Sorry about the pause. Apparently, there must be more than one version of my PowerPoint, and the one that I'm looking at doesn't really have the thing in it that I was mentioning earlier. Well, I have something about deja vu, but it's not the way I wanted to put it. Not the point that I had in my mind earlier. So here we go. I'm back on track now. I said I'd make an analogy between miracles and deja vu, but it might not be what you think. Deja vus seem like supernatural events, but that's not what I had in mind. What I had in mind is of a concept that contradicts itself in the way that Hume thinks that the concept of miracles contradicts itself. Okay, so remember, 2 steps. It's required that it violate a law of nature to be a miracle, but if it allegedly satisfies that requirement, number 1, required, violates law. Number 2, rejected thereby, because nothing violates law. Required, violates law. Rejected, allegedly violates law. Reject anything that allegedly violates law, right? So the concept built into itself is its own refutation. It must violate law. Law means never violated. So it must do what it cannot do. So it's contradictory, it's impossible, right? Similarly self-contradictory in ways that people don't realize. On one reading, there may be other readings of deja vu, but deja vu is that thing where, like, maybe right now, all of a sudden, you knew, and you're knowing that I'm going to be saying what I'm saying as I'm saying it, and you kind of remember it, but you've never seen this lecture before. And this particular moment, maybe you're having that sensation. That's deja vu. Literally means seen before. Right? Literally, the words. Deja, before, vu, seen in French. Now, Think about it. It almost means something like this, deja vu. It means, I remember it. I knew it was being said while it was being said, as if I remember it, but I know I've never experienced it before. So it's a sense of remembering something that you've never experienced. By definition, for something to count as a deja vu, it has to have that quality, that you sense it as if you remember it, while simultaneously knowing that you've never experienced it before. But remembering something implies logically that you experienced it. I can't remember what I had for breakfast unless I had something for breakfast. I can't remember what it was like to walk down the street in Rome unless I've actually been to Rome. That kind of thing. I can't remember the taste of a grapefruit unless I've actually tasted one. Right? It'd be like the first time I taste a kumquat or some fruit I've never even had before, and I go, it's as if I remember this, but I've never tasted it, right? So memory is, I experienced it before, and a trace of it is in my consciousness, like an imprint from it, right? But how can an imprint be in there if it was never imprinted in there, right? So that's the idea. I remember something that I've never experienced. But remembering requires having had experienced it, right? So it's self-contradictory in that regard. There may be other explanations, and there are other explanations of deja vu, but at least in that sense, that's the sense in which some concepts, under a certain logical analysis, contradict themselves. They're contradictory concepts. Hume is saying that the concept of a miracle is one of those. But that's because he's a strict scientifically minded empiricist who believes in laws of nature, right? And that scientific knowledge is the best kind of knowledge that we can have. And so for something to overwhelm a law, it's almost impossible, or it's logically impossible. Okay, so that's Hume's argument in a nutshell. Now I'm going to raise some criticisms of it and then give some supports for it. So what if Hume is wrong? Now, before, when I was weighing the claim of one believer versus all of science, right? Oh, I saw a miracle. That's impossible. All the logical minds in the universe, right, have established a law. There's no contest, right? But throughout human history, millions of human beings have claimed to have had supernatural experiences, or experiences that seem to defy laws of physics, like mind reading, precognitive dreams, dreams of the future, but time moves in a line, so that can't happen, and all sorts of other things like that, right? All sorts of paranormal and supernatural experiences that seem to violate laws of nature. When you add up billions of human beings having had these experiences, then the scales are not so obviously no contest, right? So maybe science has been systematically ignoring evidence. That's one possibility. And that's what spiritual believers think. Okay? So maybe all their testimony adds up. Now, I don't know if it's strong enough. That's not, like Hume said, the testimony has to be stronger than science. Well, it depends on how much evidence you're counting and how strongly you count the evidence, right? But it's not a complete knockdown, I think, if you go into this line of thinking, right? But then Hume would probably just dismiss all of those claims, and he has good reason to do it. I'm not so sure if it's knockdown proof, but we'll get to that in a moment. Hume does use one example of something that would be overwhelming, but it's not really of a miracle. It's just of something that we wouldn't understand or expect or normally have a simple explanation for. He said, if all the history books from all the different cultures around the world had the same story about 8 days of darkness, cultures that never had any exposure to each other, and they all dated it at the same time. If it turned out that, on research we found this out, we would think, well, maybe there was 8 days of darkness. Maybe some big meteorite, came near the Earth and interfered with the gravitational field of the Earth, blocked it, or even from the sun, or whatever. It's possible. It's not a miracle. It's not physically impossible, but it's the kind of thing that we might think was impossible because of the way the Earth spins around its own axis, day, night, day, night, day, night. Well, day, night, day, night, day, night, right? Maybe the Earth kept spinning, but something blocked it, right? That's not a miracle, but it's a kind of unusual claim that when anybody makes an unusual claim, what Hume is saying is you need a lot of evidence to accept unusual claims, right? So that would be an example of it. But then, like I'm saying, if you added together all the claims of supernatural experiences from billions of human beings throughout human history, they might add up to something like 8 days of darkness, right? Okay. ESP, mind reading, seeing the future, seeing ghosts, communicating with the dead, finding out someone was going to die before they did, all those kinds of things. And maybe deja vu are real experiences, near-death experiences. People experience all sorts of things when they're dead and then they're resuscitated, and there seems to be no way they could have known that. All that seems to be some kind of evidence. How weak or strong it is depends on how skeptical you are about such matters. Right? But the scientific-minded inquiry into the nature of reality should be open to the possibility that those are some kinds of valid evidence, right? Like UFOs, right? There seems to be some reason for thinking that there might be lots of good reason for thinking that there might be intelligent life in the universe, right? Because, human beings in less than 2 million years went from being, smart apes to being what we are now, right? Homo sapiens, 4.6 billion year old planet. But there are parts of the universe that are a lot older than billions of years older. So it could conceivably, and the conditions for life are all over the universe. Right, so it's conceivable that there could be species that are a billion years ahead of us in terms of evolution and having figured out scientific technology that could be traveling around the universe, and they might have been here, and their super technology might be just of stuff that we don't know, and they might have been here, and they might be the ones who perform miracles, right, throughout human history. That's a possibility, but that's not miraculous. That's just science that we don't know about yet. All right, so, okay. Here's a principle that David Hume likes, that most scientifically oriented philosophers and rational thinkers believe in. It's called Occam's razor, named after a philosopher named Willem of Ockham, a medieval character. It's called the razor because it's used to cut out unreasonable beliefs in kinds of things that we're not sure if those kinds of things even exist, like gods, demons, goblins, and ghosts, right? Bizarre other kinds of universes and whatever. Like, it's used to cut out those possibilities as unreasonable, the razor part, right? But the principle is also called the principle of parsimony. Someone who's parsimonious is frugal with their money. They're cheap, so to speak. So scientists are generally frugal or parsimonious with their beliefs, meaning we want to spend the least amount of knowledge money that we have to, so to speak, making an analogy, on any kind of beliefs that aren't really well established. Right? In Indian philosophy, the same principle is called the principle of lightness. Travel light in terms of metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics is the study of reality and what kinds of things exist, and epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? So you should try to match the two and restrict your alleged knowledge claims to those kinds of things that we can kind of prove exist or have good reason to think that they exist, so that your epistemology and your metaphysics are both light and minimalistic, right? One version of Occam's razor says something like, don't multiply entities unnecessarily, right? So in order to explain deja vu, let's just say you might have to imagine that there are multiple universes that you exist in every now and then. One of them crosses the other, and then that's why you remember something that you don't remember, because in the other world you experienced it somehow or another, you're connected. That would explain deja vu, but you've just multiplied the kinds of things that exist, like a whole other parallel universe. You have to conjure that up in your imagination to explain some phenomenon that can be easily dismissed, like as some kind of brain rot, that you think you remember something that you obviously never experienced before, right? So here's a bunch of ways of defining Occam's razor. Of any two otherwise competing hypotheses that would both explain the same data equally well, or the same phenomenon, right? They have to be equal. If they're not equal, then if one is better than the other, you go with the better hypothesis, right? But if two or more hypotheses are equal, that they would explain the same data or phenomenon, right? You should always prefer the hypothesis that travels lighter, makes less metaphysical claims, doesn't multiply entities, is less epistemologically risky, meaning less risk of being wrong, has the fewest metaphysical commitments. It doesn't commit you to multiple universes or goblins or other kinds of beings, right? It's more certain rather than less relative to everything else you know. It jibes with or is consistent with everything else that we already know, right? Or if you want to kind of summarize all of those together, philosophers typically do, and they say, prefer the simpler explanation, right? Because the simpler explanation satisfies almost all of those criteria that I just mentioned. That's what Occam's razor says. Prefer the simpler explanation and cut away the other ones with your razor. Okay. So here's a simple example of applying Occam's razor, thought experiment. Suppose you go over your friend's house and there's an attic upstairs and you hear rumbling up there, and one of your friends says, I think there are gremlins bowling up in the attic. And the other one says, no, that's probably just like a squirrel or something got in through the chimney. That kind of thing happens. So applying Occam's razor, what's the better explanation? Hopefully you could figure that out on your own. But gremlins bowling in an attic is not only outlandish and bizarre, and there's almost no reason to think that it's true. It would explain the sounds, suppose that the sounds are consistent with that, right? But squirrels would also. So which hypothesis is more preferable, squirrels or gremlins? Of course, we know squirrels exist. We're not taking any metaphysical risk in supposing that there are kinds of things called squirrels, because we know that they are. We've seen them before, and they're a fairly standard feature of life in our world. Whereas a couple of people might have claimed that they saw gremlins, but it's highly dubious whether or not such kinds of beings actually exist and aren't just something else that was misperceived as a gremlin, or a figment of someone's imagination, or a hallucination, or myth, or fable, or whatever, right? So to assume the gremlin explanation is to admit into existence, into your metaphysics, more beings than are necessary. You multiplied entities. You've added gremlins to the catalog of kinds of things that your philosophy is willing to accept that they exist. You should not multiply entities needlessly. It's unnecessary to go to the gremlin theory when the squirrel theory will explain it. The squirrel theory is more consistent with everything else that we know. It's less risky in terms of being right or wrong. It's more likely to be right than wrong, etc. Right? So it's the simpler explanation. That would be an example of Occam's razor. Okay, so let's go back to the deja vu. Forget my analogy with the idea that it's self-contradictory for now. That's not why I'm bringing it up. I'm bringing it up because I mentioned earlier, you've got One alternative hypothesis about deja vu is that, like, we're in a multiverse, or that there's a parallel world nearby, and my doppelganger, my duplicate of myself in that world, and we crossed or came close, or somehow or another the information got cross-wired from his brain to my brain. And so I remember something that I didn't actually experience because he, my psychic duplicate, somehow or another, I have accessed his memory even though I never experienced it. Now that would explain deja vu, but it multiplies endlessly, entities needlessly, whole parallel worlds, doppelgangers, psychic communication between me and my doppelganger, all kinds of needless multiplication of duplicate of entities or being duplicated. And there's no need for that because simpler explanations are available. What might a simpler explanation be? Well, here's what scientists would generally say. The circuitry in the brain for short-term memory and long-term memory, wherever each one is, are different. Short-term memory is similar to, like, whatever you're typing on now in the computer, you're in a space called random access memory. It's what's in the cache of stuff that you're open on. It's analogous to what you're paying attention to in terms of conscious memory. Short-term memory is what you're aware of in the immediate span of a few seconds. Of course, the further back in time it is, the longer it becomes more long-term memory or short-term memory. Those are somewhat flexible terms, but short-term memory is more about what you just experienced, or minutes ago at most, or an hour ago, whatever. Right? The further back in time, the more it's long-term memory. And often things that we experience don't go into long-term memory unless we think about them, where they had a very strong impact on us, they shocked us for whatever reason, they have strong association. Right? So the circuitry in our brains for short-term and long-term memory are different. Right? Just like the circuitry for the verbal center of the brain is different from the perceptual and endocrine system. So, for example, experiments have shown, monitoring human brains, that when we see a snake, it activates the stress hormone part of the brain, right? The fight or flight instinct, stress hormones that get you ready to defend yourself against a snake, run or attack or whatever. And then the verbal center of the brain catches up with that moments later, that part of the brain that says, that's a snake, right? That's verbal, conscious knowledge. That comes later. The circuitry reaching it is longer because it's part of the more evolved part of the brain that takes longer to get to, right? So there's a dual processing in the brain, slow and quick processing. Adrenaline and stuff is quick processing. Thinking and verbalizing is slower processing, right? So the circuitry for them is different. The scientific explanation of deja vu is that there's a cross circuitry, like a brain leak from one circuit to the other, because there's hundreds of thousands and millions of different wires, so to speak, little fibers going from one nerve cell to the other. So many of them, there are trillions of them that are interacting in every single blink of an eye that you're conscious, right? And one part of the brain can compensate for another and everything. So it's very simple. It's kind of like when you're typing, you don't realize. Like maybe your computer's set up that every 5 minutes it does an auto save. You don't have to hit the save button. That's conscious. You hit the save button, you're intending to put something from short-term memory, what you're working on now, random access memory, into long-term memory, which is the hard drive, long-term storage space, right? The computer auto-saves into long-term memory without you even needing to press a button. That's auto-save, right? So deja vu is like an unconscious, unintended, simultaneous auto-save. So while it's coming in, you're experiencing it as if you remember it. It's just that I remember it circuitry is being stimulated accidentally in ways that it's not normally stimulated. Now that's certainly neurologically possible, right? And any simple physical explanation is one that's going to win on an Occam's razor contest. So the parallel doppelganger in the other universe theory would explain deja vu, but so would a brain leak. And brain leaks happen all the time. Like the neurology for that is totally consistent with all of science and everything else that we know. And that does not duplicate entities needlessly. It doesn't take an epistemological or metaphysical risk. It is the simpler explanation. And so Occam's razor says, go with the brain leak theory. Now, when you have a deja vu, it just feels so powerful that you think that was not just a brain leak. But you know what? There are so many experiments that neuroscientists have done and social scientists and other cognitive scientists in the last decade or so that show that we're frequently wrong about some of the clearest, most vivid, most confident experiences that we think we're having. We can easily be fooled. So, when you take Occam's razor and join it together with thinking about what we call error theories, right? An error theory is like the brain leak theory. That's a theory that says, yes, you thought that you experienced this, but we can explain to you how your thinking that is the result of some kind of error. It's not an accurate perception. It's based on some kind of error that's unnoticed, right? We call those error theories. So the brain leak theory is an error theory. No, you didn't experience some alternative universe. The sense that you did is an error produced by your brain, right? There's all different kinds of error theories. These are theories that show that some claim is false because it involves some kind of error to produce it, or to think that it was true, or to believe that it happened, right? So Hume has a bunch of error theories, by the way, about miracles, which I'll talk about in a moment. When you take Occam's razor, which says always prefer the simpler explanation, and you can come up with an error theory for any kind of claim, right, about miracles, ESP, deja vu, precognition, you name it, right? The combination is like a 1-2 punch from the physicalist, scientifically oriented, skeptical philosopher who doesn't believe in those things. They could just say, hey, look, I've got a natural explanation. It's a simpler explanation. You've got that supernatural explanation. I have a natural explanation. The natural explanation, if it involves an error theory that would explain why you think you had a supernatural experience, that together with Occam's razor, which says always prefer the simpler explanation, that's a 1-2 punch. It's always going to win. Not that it proves that you were wrong, but what it does establish is that the more credible position, the more rational position to take is one that does not adhere to your claim, right? So in other words, if you've got Occam's razor and an error theory competing with your any kind of supernatural or non-natural theory that requires something supernatural or mystical or otherworldly or other dimensional or anything like that, the error theory plus Occam's razor is going to favor the simpler explanation, which is the natural one, according to which you're mistaken about your beliefs, right? Now that's something that's very unsettling for people because that Occam's razor plus error theory can be used to undermine almost all religious belief, almost all spiritual and supernatural belief that involves anything that's not consistent with there just being nothing other than a physical world, right? Just you could just say very simply, any natural theory, a theory that's consistent with nature and physics and natural laws, right, will always defeat any supernatural theory. So the theory that there's a God, or that there are ghosts, or that there's life after death, that there's ESP, telepathy, reincarnation, other worlds, other dimensions, any of those things, all those beliefs are going to be defeated by the theory that says, no, those can all be explained. If I have error theories like for deja vu and for all these other things, and I don't have to believe them. The burden is on you, like Hume would say. Your evidence has to be stronger than mine. My evidence is science, right? No contest. Okay, so now the religious believer can have a little bit of a comeback and say, well, okay, If there is a God, however, if there is a supernatural dimension, if there is a multiverse or something like that, right, then what appear to be laws are not laws. If there is a God, he wrote the laws the same way that a computer programmer who wrote the code for Super Mario Brothers or World of Warcraft or whatever it is, he knows all the codes and he can go in and manipulate them in ways that you just playing the game, you don't know the codes, you can't. So if there is a God and we're in his world, it's like we're characters in his video game, right? And he can just change the codes whenever he wants. He can violate the laws. He wrote the laws. He could change the laws. Now, that's a possibility, right? And then, like I said, when you add up all the miracle claims and supernatural claims from everybody throughout human history, they amount to more than just brain leak, right? Of course, if they've never happened to you, you might just go with Hume and say, nah, you know. Oh, and I said Hume has explanations. So here, Moses parts the sea, right? I saw a documentary about this. I don't know, it was a History Channel or something. That sea, at a certain time of the year, there's a low tide, and there are sand dunes. You know what a sand dune is? Here's the water level, but sand dune is the sand hills that go right up, but you just don't see them. You see this at the beach when you see people walk out and the water goes up and up and up and up, and then they keep going out further, but the water's going down. And it looks like they're standing on water, or only their knees are in the water, and they're all the way out there, but they're standing on a sand dune that's underwater, right? So it may very well have been that Moses and the Jews, by accident or he knew about it, managed to cross that sea over a sand dune path. And then when the Egyptians came after them, the tide has risen and they couldn't find a way through. And so the Jews escaped. And that could have happened. There's evidence that it might have happened. And it might be the kind of thing with the telephone game where I tell you a story, you tell him a story, he tells her a story, 25 people down the line. By the time it gets back to me, the story has changed significantly, right? So generation after generation after generation before today, or before it even got written down that Moses parted the sea, it could have been, wow, we were so lucky. It was a miracle we escaped. We went right through the ocean. That's a miracle, right? That could have gotten turned to Moses parted the sea, right? There's your error theory. Telephone game, sand dunes, good fortune, exaggeration over time, desire to believe, right? All of those factors could explain why people would believe that story passed down to the present. And similar explanations for every other story. Similar explanations can be imagined, error theories, for every single story. Hume says a number of these things in general, that when it comes to these kinds of stories, it's like sitting around a campfire and telling ghost stories. People get off on it in a way. When people have that kind of story, they get some kind of social recognition in human history to be somebody to tell a tale like that, right? We are storytelling creatures. We love stories, spooky stories, miracle stories, supernatural stories, because those are things that make you wonder about what's it all about, right? And so those kinds of stories would naturally get woven into our religions over time, right? And what did I say in the very beginning? What's the function and purpose of a miracle? A miracle is supposed to be evidence of God, or of at least the gods or the spirits of your religion. Every religion has these stories. You could say that's because they're all true, but the funny thing is, almost every member of every religion believes that only the miracle stories in their religion are true. They are all atheistic skeptics when it comes to the miracle stories of all the other religions. So Jews probably don't believe that Jesus performed miracles. They don't believe that he was a prophet, right? And Jews and Christians don't believe that Muhammad performed any miracles. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims probably all don't believe in miracle stories from Hinduism or Buddhism, right? In fact, Hume would probably say all of those people disbelieve the miracle stories in other religions, and when they do, they're using the kind of reasoning that I'm advocating. Occam's razor and error theories, right? When we say, yeah, those people with that weird religion, they believe that those miracles happen, but we could imagine how stories like that might have gotten around and got exaggerated over time, and maybe even someone lied about it, because, if you could convince people that you're like in The Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain, The Wizard of Oz, right? You could trick people into believing that you're a supernatural priest or emissary of God. There's a lot of social, credits in that, right? So people lie. People benefit from these stories, right? Just think of all the phony preachers on TV, of people sending them in millions of dollars, right? Because they act like they got the spirit in them somehow or another. So there's enough reason to be skeptical and to have error theories about just about anything when it comes to Occam's razor and error theories about anything supernatural. Okay, let me see if I have anything that I forgot to cover. Yeah, one more point, at least one more point. If there are supernatural phenomena, should we expect them to be repeatable, however? Right, we don't understand how they work. Okay. So I'll say another thing about the telephone game. Jewish theologians argue that the events that happened allegedly on Mount Sinai and around the time of Moses were witnessed by thousands of Jews. God speaking to mankind and so on, right? Water parting, all these things. And like it would be impossible to convince a whole generation that they experienced something that they didn't. And then those stories have been passed down, written and passed down. Every single generation rehearses and remembers these things. And so how this tradition could have happened without it originally happening, it's not so credible. And there's a rabbi, I forget his name, but I saw a YouTube video of his. One of my Jewish theologian friends recommended it to me, who makes that argument specifically. And he said that he did all this research about like these kinds of myths in almost every other culture and religion, that I forget how the argument goes, but it goes something like this. The ones from Judaism are the only ones that involve a mass entire culture allegedly experiencing something and passing that on. All the other ones, I guess you could say, are subject to error theory in simpler ways. But this one is unique in that regard, right? I'll let you be the judge of that. I don't know. What else did I want to say? Oh, yes. The X-Files type reply. If you've ever watched the show X-Files, then you know that many of these supernatural type phenomena that are in all the world's religions and myths, right? They happen in the X-Files show, but there's some kind of physical explanation for them. There's some kind of things about nature and science that we just don't know yet, right? But that's the whole angle in X-Files, right? That, there's just aspects of science that we don't know yet. So that's a possibility, but this was a lot of my students over the years will say, well, what if there's just these things are possible, but we don't know about it yet? And maybe if time travel is possible, maybe future humans traveled back in time and performed those miracles using technology that we don't know, like to help Jesus walk on water or whatever it is, right? But like those would be X-Files type explanations for anything, right? But then they wouldn't be miracles. They would just be things that rarely happen, right? Like 8 Days of Darkness, right? A spaceship from another galaxy could put a tractor beam on us or whatever and hold the Earth a certain way so we have 8 days of darkness or whatever. Those are physically possible. on certain possibilities physically, but then they wouldn't be miracles, right? So that's not going to help the miracle theory, right? If they're scientifically possible, then they're not evidence of something supernatural. That's the problem with that. I think that might be it. Yeah, that's my last one. Right. Time travel is its own problem because of the grandmother paradox. I'll just mention it just for fun to end this note on something puzzling. If time travel is possible and you could go back in time and find your grandparents before they even met each other and kill both of them, then they would have never had your parents or one of your parents. And then you would have never been born. But if you were never born, how could you go back and kill them? I'll let you think about that. All right. Occam's razor, error theories. Miracle. It's required that it violate a law of nature and therefore rejected because it allegedly violates the law of nature. It contradicts itself. Just like deja vu, you remember something that you know you didn't experience. That's a contradiction because memory is that you experienced something that you did experience, not anything else. Okay. Occam's razor, always prefer the simpler explanation. Error theories, some naturalistic way to explain how you could be wrong about something. If it's naturalistic and you've got Occam's razor, that's always going to defeat. This is my little summary. And that's it. There's Hume on miracles. All right. Thank you.